All right, now to help make sense of what is happening at this moment, we're being joined by Mr. Hanno Klink, who is a former Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia from Washington, D.C. Mr. Klink, thank you very much indeed, sir, for taking time out and speaking to us here on WION. And let me, in fact, start off by asking you this. You know, in the aftermath of the dissolution of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, the Russians were given assurances that the NATO military alliance would not move an inch eastwards towards Russia. But what we are looking here in the last 3 decades is that not only have the NATO nations been increasing and NATO has been expanding closer and closer to Russia, but this one specific missile base in Poland has also now been made operational. In your assessment, do you think the West has in fact gone back on the reassurances that were made to the Russians about NATO's eastward expansion?
Well, thank you very much for having me today. I would start with saying that this base that has just been declared operational in northern Poland is actually a missile defense base. So it's not offensive missiles, meaning it's not that missiles will be launched there against targets in other parts of the world. It is a base that has defensive missiles designed to shoot down incoming offensive missiles. And if you look at the history of this, it's been about 20 years or so since this base was first discussed during the Bush administration. It was during the Obama administration that this base, it's an Aegis Ashore facility, was finally decided upon. And now in late 2024, it is operational in conjunction with a similar facility that was opened up in Romania several years back. And this is all meant to work in conjunction also with Aegis-equipped U.S. naval ships. The intended defense is actually more focused on Iran and other actors and not Russia. And that's been said from the very, very beginning. This is not new. This, I would say, the only thing that's newsworthy here is that after many delays, the base is actually now operational.
Right. It's interesting that you say that these defensive military bases are aimed more at Iran. But looking at where they are positioned geographically, it'll be tough for you to explain that to the Russians, because the Russians will turn around and say that this particular defense base that has turned up in Poland, that has now become operational, is just 220 kilometers from Kaliningrad, the Russian enclave, which houses the biggest Russian nuclear arsenal there. And how do you, in fact, explain the difference, to people who may not be very familiar with the difference between what is an offensive missile base and what is a defensive base? Because in the event of a war, both of them can actually work pretty much the same.
I would say that that's not actually a true statement. Defensive missiles are meant to shoot down incoming objects, not meant to target objects on the ground or at sea or what have you. So the missiles, the SM-3 missiles that are in this facility, they are designed to shoot down other missiles, just like SM-3 missiles on American and other Navy's ships are designed as an anti-air and anti-missile defense system. So I would tell you again, I'm not a physicist.
If I can just interject. Yeah, now, the S-300 air defense missile systems, they are meant for defensive purposes. They are interceptors. But in the Russia-Ukraine war, they've been repeatedly used to strike at targets, both by Ukraine and by the Russians.
So I don't know how the Russians are deploying S-300 systems. I can tell you that SM-3 systems, missile systems that have been in use by the U.S. and other allies are defensive systems designed to strike down primarily incoming missiles. This has been the case, for instance, in the Red Sea, targeting Houthi ballistic missiles and the like. So I'm not a physicist, and I'm not going to try to explain the physics behind intercepting missiles. But the reason that Romania and Poland were selected for these missiles defensive sites decades ago, was to intercept missiles primarily on trajectories from Iran.
I'll just press you one more time. For people who are watching this from, in Moscow, how do you explain that to the defense strategists in Moscow, that these missiles are not meant against the Russians? This is Poland and this is Romania that you're talking about.
That's correct. And I would say perhaps less to your viewers in Moscow, but in other parts of the world, it is the Russians that have invaded their neighbors, Georgia, for instance, and Ukraine most recently, and still. So the offensive actions have come from the Russian Federation,
Right.
not from NATO, not from any of the countries that were previously occupied by and under the Soviet yoke. So I would dismiss those criticisms. I would, though, admit quite candidly that everything that NATO does is seen as a threat by the Russians. Whereas if you ask any of the NATO member states, particularly on the eastern flank, particularly those countries in the Baltic states and Eastern Europe that have very, very recent experience living under Soviet and Russian oppression, they view what Russia has been doing and is doing with much concern.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. We're completely out of time. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Hano Klik, for joining us and getting us those insights there. For all the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.